Today I want to talk about trading our way to a vital economy. And the key here is that in order for us to have an economy that is vital and that actually contributes to regional prosperity, we need to be trading outside of our region. So it's a matter of having goods and services that are delivered into areas outside of our region and having cash flows come back in. When you look back over history, there's actually a strong precedent for this, and I recently came across a book by Arthur Herman entitled "How the Scots Invented the Modern World," wherein it became really clear how it was that Adam Smith, perhaps the leading proponent in history for free trade, or certainly one that we go back to often when we talk about trading, you could see that in fact part of how he could write about the wealth of nations was, and the importance of trade, was he is witness to the magic played by the role of Scotland in brokering trade basically between North America and continental Europe. And in fact that trade brought Scotland from being really a rather desperate region to being roughly an equal partner on the British Isle. In fact, he could write about this because he was witness to the advantages of trade. So when you look at this, what you have to realize is that those lessons that were so important in that day and age, that it becomes the seminal work in economics, really are equally important to us today. The same realities apply. Trade is absolutely essential to a vital economy. And if you look at the second bullet, it is the point I'm trying to make there is that we've got to promote economic exchanges, and those exchanges have to occur beyond the region, so that we need local and Western North Carolina strategies that assure that each of our counties is providing goods and services that bring in trade beyond regional boundaries. The importance of this is that just moving money from one hand to another within our region will not bring regional prosperity. The money needs to flow in from outside the region, and that's absolutely key to that vitality that we so seek. We also need to recognize then that this requires that we must link our local networks to broader regions, but increasingly in today's world it's not just enough to do that in a broader region around our own, but we need to think in terms of how it is that we link to a global economy. So the importance here is that we need strategies that involve transportation systems that support our regional initiatives, but really take those and link them to worldwide markets. So the key here in terms of where we are with opt-in is that economic vitality requires trade, and it's only trade that accesses broader economies. So that access has always required logistics, and in fact it always will. So what we're going to talk about as we go forward here is the idea that without transportation we really can't manage to, and the infrastructure involved, that we really can't accomplish what we need to sustain our standard of living. So that requires connectivity. And early on, in the 60s, the concern was how do we connect the Appalachian region to the national economy, because we were seen as being isolated from the broader national economy. At the time, highway systems seemed like the appropriate way to do that. So with the advent of the Appalachian Regional Commission, what was developed was the Appalachian Development Highway System. It was intended to be a robust highway system to connect the region to the national economy. 50 years later, we see that we're moving close to having accomplished that, and we can see many of the benefits, and time and again we see the economic advantages of that system and how it is operated. But that's not adequate for the future, because the future is going to require that we be connected to that global economy. What that means is that we're going to have broader strategies, certainly including highways, and I would argue railroads, but also seaports, inland waterways, and even broadband as we look into the future. Point is, we still need the Appalachian Development Highway System, but it's now only part of a much broader concern with connectivity. So the ADHS today must be completed, I would argue, but we must envision this as part of connectivity to a broader, evolving global network. The other thing is that as we look at this, the reason it's important to us is that we're trying to support business success. Business success is what creates a vital economy. So the key is to support certainly future businesses, and we're pointed that way in part, but we need to also recognize that we're trying to make sure that we sustain and provide a good climate for the success of current businesses as well. And when we look toward that, one of the keys here is that business risk. So it's opportunity for the future, but it's also dealing with business risk for current businesses. As we look at what's going on here, one of the things that's critical is to realize that Western North Carolina is not just a repeat of other regions or something where we can take a model that's been applied somewhere else and that'll do. We're considerably different from the rest of North Carolina, and we need to make that point to our to policymakers and people involved in state government that we're not just the same as other areas. And even within our region, we see substantial differences. Just when we start talking about the 7 counties, what you realize is that each of those counties is experiencing somewhat unique economic conditions. But the other piece of this is that it's not just our region if we're going to make this work, but we're impacted by events and activity in surrounding jurisdictions. We've got to coordinate and cooperate across political boundaries, and the first key here is that sometimes we have trouble even being aware of things that are happening in other locations, and I'll address some of those as we move forward here. But the key is that Western North Carolina and the opt-in 7 counties will not succeed without connections outside the region. So we need to avoid being myopic or experiencing tunnel vision. We need to look outside our region, see what's going on, and see how what we do connects with those broader forces. Okay, so what might affect current businesses? Because certainly we need success there before we even look at any of these other things. And the key here is risk. And what you see is, first of all, no manager is very eager to encounter a whole lot of risk. Most of us are pretty risk averse. So we do a lot. We'd pay almost any price in many cases to avoid a whole lot of risk. That means that we'll look to avoid uncertainty. And we will look at how conditions in our region create uncertainty for businesses. We also see that in order that what we're looking for is how can we actually address the future and deal with things that might damage our business or create a situation where we can't reap benefits that otherwise we might do. Risk is really the combination of those two things. A probability that something will occur, certainly if it's more likely, we generally see it as being more risky, and the extent to which it is damaging to our businesses. Now I'd like to take a look at how it is that transportation actually creates risk for firms. And again, uncertainty is a part of the risk. One of the things that businesses are facing when transportation is uncertain is that their costs vary considerably, and in some cases it's easy to see that, for example, fuel prices increasing can drive costs that make a business non-competitive. Another thing, though, is that it's possible for our transportation infrastructure to make transportation unavailable or for our businesses, or to add distances or time that make our businesses non-competitive because they can't compete based on time or other things. The key here is that we need to be competitive in linking to other businesses. Then from our regional needs, connecting to the national economy is obviously a part of this, and the Appalachian Developmental Highway System was intended to address it. But when we look toward global economies, it's going to be important both to be able to move stuff on highways, but to recognize that, for example, trucking materials is more costly as fuel prices go up than would be moving stuff on rail or otherwise. So as we look toward the global economy, it's going to be important to remember that we need to be able to move between modes of transportation. So intermodal options are important. Connections to seaports will be important because in order to trade with other areas, the most efficient, cost-efficient way to move materials is on, particularly bulky materials, is on water, and so sea transportation is still a mainstay in global trade. One of the things that we see is that, in fact, a big part of risks, some of the things that we're worried, those of us who are studying this are worried about in terms of the future, is that there's something of a perfect storm occurring in the global economy. We've got growing, and we see quite a bit of growth as our economy is beginning to pick up. But we also see a growing but very volatile demand structure. So we see lots of rapid fluctuations, and it's hard to deal with those if you're looking at long lead times. We see capacity constraints in every mode of transportation. So once again, if you're dependent upon only one mode of transportation, that represents a real problem for you. You may not be able to find the ability to move things that you need to. As I commented earlier, high and increasing fuel costs are a big part of that perfect storm as well, and certainly I anticipate that we'll see, as we're looking at all sorts of uncertainty in the Middle East right now, we'll continue to see volatility and increases in fuel costs. And then on top of all of that, we have failing infrastructure. We're starting with inadequate infrastructure, and we'll look at a little bit at that in a minute here, but we're also we're seeing all kinds of failure in what already is not adequate to our purposes. We need to recognize that our region is unique in terms of the opportunities to deal with some of these, and we need to also recognize that money to deal with these problems is limited, and in fact, I anticipate that if we've got an opportunity to do something now, we probably ought to do it. That public monies may not be available in the future to deal with some of these limitations. And again, we'll need to coordinate across political boundaries. So now let's place this in a broader infrastructure context. Okay, a real key here is to recognize that when I talk about infrastructure and transporting freight and these sorts of things, and we might also worry about transporting passengers, particularly passengers that are involved, say, in tourism, which brings cash into our region. So that actually is once again one of those important cash flows that we'd like to support. But if you look at it, our infrastructure represents a real problem to us. So when you look at global competitiveness, if you look at the World Economic Forum, they do an annual report on global competitiveness. If you look at 2008-2009, the United States was ranked number 1 in competitiveness. That means we've got the most competitive economy in the world. By 2012-2013, we're ranked number 7, and we're declining rapidly. So in fact, what we're seeing is that because of the competitiveness of our economy, what this essentially means is that our standard of living and our ability to sustain our standard of living is being left behind, and so that others are eating our lunch in some ways. If you look at that competitiveness, a key part of it is the extent to which our infrastructure support the kinds of trade that leave us competitive in that global environment. So nationally, we're losing ground relative to other countries, and our infrastructure, as you can see, is actually serving as a counterweight. It's withholding us. It's restraining us from competing effectively, and that's not so much true for a lot of our competitors. So our infrastructure is a problem to us in global trade, and in fact, it's likely that in the future we're going to see more concern about this. A key argument here is that while we have lots of infrastructure and a lot of transportation infrastructure, and you see I've highlighted that here, that infrastructure, those investments in infrastructure have tended to be biased toward passengers, not toward freight. And in fact, sometimes if you talk to policymakers and politicians, they'll tell us that people vote, and so moving them is a big deal, but freight does not vote. But I want to point out that is what keeps us competitive in the global economy, is the movement of freight. As I said before, tourism might be the exception. If you look at what we do in investments in infrastructure, we tend to favor urban areas, and those urban areas, the tendency is to focus on moving people around in those regions. For those urban areas, that also results in their having lots of options in terms of freight. Generally, rural areas are disadvantaged in this equation, and the thing we particularly tend to be disadvantaged in terms of is movement of freight within our region. If we look at the infrastructure, one of the key ways that we might look at this is there are various groups that do ratings, but the American Society of Civil Engineers does a routine rating, and so this is a pretty standard way to talk about where are we in terms of our infrastructure. If you look at it, I've highlighted those elements that are particularly involved with freight transportation. I would suggest to you that any of us that had a child bring home a report card that looked like this would be very unhappy. And also I want you to note that the cost of actually dealing with this, that is just bringing us to adequacy, is escalating rapidly. One of the things that suggests is that there will be substantial competition for resources to deal with our challenges in terms of transportation, and that's something we need to keep in mind. If you then look toward North Carolina, what you see is that in some ways we may be seen as doing slightly better, but that we still have lots of problems. And in fact, we might take a look at two particular areas that are important in our region. In terms of the North Carolina infrastructure, two top concerns, at least from our perspective, would be roads and bridges. You notice that they're marginally adequate in terms of at least grading, but if you dig a little deeper, what you realize is that 45% of our roads are in poor or mediocre condition, so they are not adequate really to supporting the kinds of transportation that are necessary. The other thing is that if you want to be just a little bit on the dark side, you might take a look at the state of our bridges and realize that maybe when you cross a bridge, at least about a third of the time you ought to be holding your breath in terms of getting to the other side. I'm overstating it slightly, but the reality is that the bridge that recently collapsed in Washington State was in fact rated as being functionally obsolete, but it was not deficient at the time of its failure. So we're talking about a third of our bridges just not being adequate to support what we need. bottom line is that in terms of our businesses, this means that there are increased transportation costs, that transportation reliability and performance is degraded, and that there's reduced availability. And you can see this particularly in terms of our options in terms of roadway transportation, and we'll address some other areas. But on the next slide here, specific to our region, we don't have the broad range of options we see in other regions, and so those areas of risk are exacerbated here. So I have placed in this slide the map of our region broadly, and the ADHS corridors that are within our region. I also then on this map have circled a couple areas of concern. One of them in particular, I-40. We've seen that repeatedly subjected to rock slides that curtail that as an option for transportation. That was so bad in 2009-2010 that in fact Google Maps and others actually deleted that section of I-40 from the maps simply to prevent people from thinking that they could traverse through that region. We had trucks getting stuck on various back roads trying to get around that region. We had people getting stuck in snowstorms up on top of Max Patch, this sort of thing. So they actually removed it. But I think that pretty clearly speaks to the extent to which that was an opportunity. Notice that at roughly the same time, US 64 was slid full as well, and that in fact there was a landslide on US 441 as well. The bottom line is we were rapidly running out of options, and if it had not been for Corridor B, I-26, as an alternative, we would have been really in trouble in terms of moving freight in this region. You might also keep in mind that at the same time there was a part of I-81 that would have been the leg back to the connection with I-40 that was where there was a bridge that was had problems, and they had to do emergency repairs. So we were very close to really shutting down that portion of our region. The point there is that a range of alternatives, of options, redundancy, gives you ways to overcome failure in one particular corridor or another. When you look at infrastructure in North Carolina, and unfortunately one of the challenges here is that we're going to have to get buy-in from other folks in the state to actually accomplish doing things in terms of addressing our infrastructure. I tend to hear a lot about how many connections there are, how many corridors there are within the state of North Carolina, and so this map from NCDOT shows a lot of those connections. But notice that those connections are in other portions of the state. We're largely devoid of those transportation corridors, that infrastructure that would connect us with other portions of the region. Also recognize that the reality is that trade in western North Carolina is largely conducted north and south of us, not to the east. So those corridors that are east of us often are of limited value. So part of our concern is how is it that we actually connect our region outside the region so that we can effectively trade both nationally and in the global environment. I think you can see why folks were concerned about the ADHS and those linkages, those corridors that were a part of that system, and their importance within our region. Okay, so, but we've talked about highways and the importance of options there, but highways are only one of the ways we might connect with the broader economy. And so another possibility, and one that we ought to seriously consider, is rail connectivity. And so if you look at the North Carolina Railroad system, you see that once again our connectivity looks different from other regions in the state, and I've only provided the western a portion of the state here, but even within this map it becomes pretty clear what's going on. There are a number of developments around us here that are rather important. One is that there is a crescent corridor which will go up to our west and north. There's a Norfolk Southern corridor that's a major trunk in the national rail system. On that new trunk, there is a proposed and under part of the strategic plan for Norfolk Southern is a new inland port that is to be positioned roughly in Newmarket in Jefferson County, Tennessee. There's connectivity from Asheville that direction. One of the challenges there is that line, though, if you look south, is not currently under service going south of us, and that's in part because of the major concern there is what's called the Saluda Grade, and we'll look at that in a moment. But if you look to our west, there's also a rail line that existed at one time that served as a direct connection into Atlanta. So our region had rail connectivity into Georgia and Tennessee by those means, and there's roughly a 15-mile gap there from Murphy to between Mineral Bluffs and Blue Ridge in Georgia. That would represent another option for business in our area if we address those concerns. I've provided some pictures just to show you what's going on. The first is of the railroad trestle, or the remnants of a railroad trestle in Murphy. This is part of that line, those 15 miles that I was talking about, in what I've here called the Murphy Gap. That line there at one time actually served as a way to supply Asheville when rail lines east of Asheville were subjected to flooding back early in the 20th century. So it has worked in the past to actually provide the kind of options in our region that would help us make sure that we reduced our transportation risk. And it's a possibility, something we might want to consider at this point in time. The other picture is of the Saluda Grade. In this case, I'm standing in Saluda looking south and east, and you can see that the rail line basically goes out of sight. That portion of rail line was at one time, is I guess, still the steepest mainline grade in the United States, and is not currently in service. But once again, some work has suggested by some civil engineers at NC State has suggested that actually it'd be possible to address that grade with a little bit of realignment of that easement. Okay, so there are rail options that might be useful to our region. The other piece of this is that in general, rail options require intermodal ability at this point in time. And so the next slide that I've provided is just a slide of inland ports, a picture from the Appalachian Regional Commission of a map that they have showing existing and developing inland container ports. Notice that those basically are occurring around us, not in our region. But again, thinking in terms of ways that we might be able to consolidate freight flows will be an important part of how we might address transportation risk within our region. So some key observations from all this information that I've provided for you. First, the question of should we do something, or what if we don't do the right thing, or do we have to do all of these things? I think the key here is to recognize that standing still, being stationary, going with where we are, really doesn't represent an option. Failure to move forward could very easily present us with the same kind of situation that was seen in the early 60s. The reality is that at that time we were seen in our region as standing apart from the national economy and being disadvantaged by that. 50 years later, we see that we truly are a part of the national economy, but we need to recognize that there's still a gap in that, but more importantly, that that's not good enough, that we've got to be thinking into the future. We can't afford another 50-year hiatus while we try to catch up with the movement in terms of the globalization. That we risk by not doing something, or actually economically crippling this region, and I don't think that's acceptable. And so a key part of what we've got to address is how it is that we're going to move freight quickly, predictably, and cost effectively so that we can sustain our current businesses and support and encourage future business development. As we do this, we must recognize that we are relatively isolated from resources that others access more easily. And I think there are a number of ways we can look at that, and I'd be delighted to consider that with you. But for the moment, we must recognize that we are not like everybody else, and that our freight flows tend to look quite different from other areas, including other areas within North Carolina. So we need a set of solutions that are unique to our situations, and that's one of the values of this opt-in process, is that we get a chance to actually think about what it is that our region specifically needs, as opposed to whatever we might get fed from outside. But we also have to think about how it is that we're going to cooperate and coordinate with others so that we actually get what we need. Okay, so some implications. We're going to have to figure out how it is that we're going to plan and execute freight initiatives that coordinate with other initiatives within the state, that's political reality, but also coordinate with those areas around us more broadly. But while we do that, we need to also recognize that we don't want to subordinate what we need to those other initiatives, but that instead we observe the distinctive nature of what we're facing. So some useful undertakings that we might consider include that we must first begin to gain regional awareness, and I mean by that we need awareness of what we're facing in each of our counties. We need awareness of what we're facing in the 7 counties together. We need awareness of what's going on in Western North Carolina. We need awareness of North Carolina, but we also need awareness of South Carolina, Georgia, Tennessee, and Virginia potentially even. We need awareness of these other areas, and to recognize that what we do needs to connect with these other areas if we're going to make that ours work. We need to coordinate the freight flows within our region. That will help us, and that's a low cost kind of a solution. We need to think about how it is that we're going to continue to advocate for needs within our region, and we may want to think about some dedicated efforts in that direction. I do believe that we need to consolidate freight in our region so that we utilize our resources efficiently and effectively in reducing risk and enabling our businesses. Okay, so those so far have been rather low-cost concerns. Let's look at some of the costs that we need to consider. One is that I do believe that we need to think about how it is that we make sure that we've got the highway resources we need. The reality is, in the United States, we still move an awful lot of freight by truck. That may change in the future, and we need to think that direction, but we also need to address current reality, and so we need to look at how it is that we complete the ADHS, that we get a network and connect to a network in a useful way, but we need to think about exactly how that needs to be done as well. And so I think there's a lot of opening for thinking about that. I also think, though, that we ought to consider ways that we could potentially also combine with this some thinking toward the future about how it is that we might have freight capability, freight capacity, and potentially passenger capacity that would connect us effectively with the Atlanta area, but how it is we might get freight, how feasible it might be to bring in some of these other rail corridors that are currently out of service. And in the end, a big key here is to think big, coordinate across political boundaries, and in many cases those political boundaries actually stand as an impediment to our accomplishing the things that we need. I appreciate this chance to talk with you, and want to thank you, and certainly open my availability to answering questions or any comments that you might have. Thank you so much.